Okay, welcome all, and thank you for joining today's session, which takes a look at a range of geopolitical issues affecting the wine export market and how Australia can best position itself to navigate these issues. My name is Michael Downey, and as always, before we make a start, a couple of quick reminders for anyone new to AWRI webinars. To provide a comment or to ask a question, please open the Q&A section of the webinar. Type in your question and click to send it through. Also, just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available to view later this afternoon via the AWRI's YouTube channel. Now, for those of you that have just joined, welcome. Today's webinar takes a look at the global impact of COVID-19 and other geopolitical issues on the wine export market. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Tony Battaglene, the Chief Executive for Australian Grape and Wine. Since joining the Winemakers Federation of Australia back in '99, Tony has become a major driver of strategy for the sector, including developing and implementing market access strategy, overseeing biosecurity, research and development, and industry policy and strategy. His strong international focus has also resulted in developments of key networks with competitors and other industries to further the interests of the Australian wine sector. Tony, it's fantastic to have your expertise on hand for today. And if you're ready to get going, I'll hand it over to you to take it away.
Thanks very much, Michael. And I'll just share my screen and I'll get into it. So first of all, I'd like to thank the AWRI for inviting me along to this present on this topic. It's something that does keep me awake at night. It is also something that if any of you watch what the documents I was sharing the screen, a large number of them are in Chinese, which just shows that what the current thinking is and what are the current major impacts that are likely to affect us. So I'm going to talk about trade, geopolitics and the future of the Australian wine industry. First of all, there's the slide of who we are. For those who don't know, that we represent both grape growers and winemakers. We're unashamedly a representative advocacy body, and we are there to do all those things on behalf of the industry that individual wine producers can't, because they either don't have the capability, capacity or size. We are recognised as a representative body for the federal government, which is very useful, which gives us an entree into both federal and state politics. It's pretty clear that 2020 has been a pretty tough year. The fires that kicked us off back in November of the year before, and then went through, right through, and then the smoke taint and the rest. Then when we thought we were through that, we got COVID, and now we've got the China issue, which, and I'll talk about all these a little bit. It was pretty clear that when 2020 dawned, we already had a weak domestic economy. Anyone who's selling wine out there knows it's been really tough, and it was tough before we had the bushfires, Brexit, and the geopolitical tensions. There has been a lot of uncertainty internationally and domestically, but it's just got a whole new dimension and got a whole lot worse with COVID-19. We still don't know when it's going to finish. We still don't know the full extent. We just know that it's not going to be good. The anti-dumping case and the subsequent countervailing duties case launched by China has also added to the complexity, and it's made it much more difficult to see actually where and how we're going to come out of this. The only thing that is clear is that not everyone will survive this, and that businesses need to be really agile and responsive, because otherwise it will be a very difficult job through in the next couple of years. So the major risks that I'll talk about some of these in more detail, but the COVID-19 recovery process, I'll talk about that briefly. The geopolitical concerns is obviously paramount and impacts everyone in the industry, whether you export or don't export, and we'll talk about that later. In particular, anti-dumping countervailings, that's front and centre of my mind at the moment. Drought, fire, environmental risk, all key issues that are going to impact on the industry and our licence to operate. You cannot underestimate the ability of the anti-alcohol and the public health bodies to try and close down our sector. And the thing I can tell you is that they're winning despite our best efforts. So that's a real threat that I won't talk about today, but it's something that's probably worthy of a discussion at a later date. So today, I just want to talk mainly about the geopolitical side of it. You know, what does it mean, and can we do something about it, and how is it going to play out? And as I've pointed out, there's quite a few issues that are happening in that sphere at the moment. It's a big issue. It's not well understood, but it's all about money. Geopolitics is all about money, and it's all about strategic power. So there's three dominant economies or trading blocs in the world. They're the EU, the US, and China. There's others with big influence, such as Russia, but each of those they're pretty similar sized at the moment, and they count for obviously most of global trade and most of our global gross domestic product. So the way that economic power works is that it needs to have cooperation among those major powers, because without this, they will be at loggerheads, and unless they support a multilateral system, and we'll talk about this in some detail, it won't work, and then it becomes a lawless society where strength provides the winners, and the rest of us, who are quite small, will be the losers. It's clear that US and Europe are no longer share the same outlook on trade policy. We've seen the case taken by the US on wine from Europe into their country, and so they've got big tariffs that's impacted on the US industry. We've seen that China is really positioning itself as the third major power. It's got very difficult to understand the Chinese system, even how close you are. The state involvement is so close with a lot of industries, so the state-owned companies often have strong government involvement, but also it makes it very difficult to differentiate between government and industry. And I'll talk about that a little in respect to the countervailing duties and anti-dumping case with China. But what it does mean is that these three big powers it's almost impossible for them to agree on a common approach to anything. And this geopolitical rivalry between the US and China is just clouding the waters. The EU is staying out of it as much as it can, and they've been targeted very much by the US as well, who are normally a natural ally, and that's created an additional tension in what used to be a bipolar world that's now a tripolar world. The consensus in the US, and indeed you see it within Australia, China is a powerful adversary. It is someone that the US see as wanting to take over their leadership role in the world. And they believe that their best way to do this is to control economic power within the US by restricting China, and that will put the pressure on an exporter like China to change its economic system. So it's pretty clear that the China-US trade relations will not only dominate the world conversation, but also be subject to political disruptions and impact on what we all do in the export markets. And you need to be clear that Australia relies on the export market, not just for wine, with our 65% of exports, but also in just about every other product we have. So what happens internationally drives everything domestically. The important thing is that WTO rules, so the rules-based trading system, it doesn't really apply because of this bilateral relationship. They're both big, strong, and ugly enough that they can ignore it. And they also are deliberately, in the case of the US, trying to weaken that trading system so that it makes it I guess, more difficult to be used against them. The EU is still undecided on how it's going to join this global power push. It does have a more pragmatic view, and because it depends on the exports, it's got that strong preference for multilateral rules. So it's unlikely that it's going to deliberately take on China head to head. But and it's very important to see who backs who in this whole international debate. The Trump effect cannot be underestimated. Trump, as various described as, well, by his supporters, he's a great man who has puts America first. By his opponents, he's a deranged lunatic. You can make up your mind. I don't really want to go into that debate. But Trump's view on foreign policy is interesting. He manages to antagonize everyone. So it involves battles with his allies, such as the EU and others, such as China. It doesn't matter who it is. You may recall that just after Trump was elected, he was going to take Australia on in a case on steel or aluminium, I can't remember which it was, which was talked down by Malcolm Turnbull at the time, but he is willing to use any means he can. he does try to use domestic, both legal rationale, but also a domestic voice, and bring in those things that will appeal to his constituents, such as national security threat, and then he could bring on tariffs, quotas, or imports, and suggest that all imports are creating a problem for the producers of, or the very subsidised producers in the US. Then you get the retaliation by the trading partners, then you get further escalation, further threats, and the whole trade and investment environment becomes problematic, and people are unwilling to invest, and the global economy suffers. And that's what we've seen for the last few years. Wine's directly been impacted in this debate. So it's collateral damage in the fight over subsidies to plane manufacturers. So the battle between Boeing and Airbus. There's certainly those large tariffs on French, German, Spanish and UK wines. Not so important for UK, I wouldn't have thought, but they're going to stay in place for the foreseeable future. And it's still a long way for a solution. We are pretty sure that we will see a retaliation from the EU in the near future. They've been talking about it. So leaving the positive fields of the US and the rest of the world, it's probably worthwhile talking a little bit about China. We've got very strong trading relationship with China. They're our largest trading partner, and we're the leading supplier of resources for China. So we've, and also the education sector has become very, very important. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand that politically, our relationship has its ups and downs, or its downs and downs in more recent times. And these have concerned both Chinese investment, the South China Sea issues, the arrest of Chinese Australian citizen China. We saw that with Rio Tinto and another and others which are well publicised. You know, we've had journalists leave recently in China. So it's fair to say it's probably the worst we've ever had in relationships. Australian ministers have now got an overall rhetoric about diversifying our export markets to reduce relying on a single buyer. Easier said than done. Very hard, as anyone in the wine sector knows, to diversify from your highest value market into another market. Clearly, in recent times, there's no shortage of Australian government decisions which have angered Beijing. These, you know, the COVID inquiry is a public one, banning Huawei from 5G telecommunications. There's been a couple of recent Foreign Investment Review Board decisions. And then, so this has just created that tension. The decision by the MOFCOM, the Ministry of Commerce in China, to open an anti-dumping investigation into our wine imports, the latest in a series of measures. It's obviously partly designed to punish Canberra over the political disputes, but it does have a strong economic underpinning to it. So came around on 18th of August was when the official anti-dumping investigation was launched. It was launched because of the China Alcoholic Drinks Association. Now, CADA is a quasi-government industry body, so it's our equivalent in China, representing all the alcohol industries, but it's also got a very close link into the Ministry of Commerce. So close that during the similar investigations in Europe, there were MOFCOM officials present when the industries were negotiating outcomes on potential technical exchanges. So it's a very close link. In a normal situation, this investigation will be completed in 12 months, so 18th of August 2021, but there's a potential for a further extension. That's what happened in Bali. It had an extra 6 months. Important to note that a product under investigation is bottled wine in under 2 litre packages. Doesn't include sparkling wine, just includes bottled wine. For those of you who know most about the export market, probably 98% of our exports to China are red wine in 750 ml bottles, or 98% of this particular area. So red wine, dry red wine in 750 ml bottles. 10 companies were named by CADA in the application. These aren't the only ones under investigation though. So other companies have also registered for the investigation. These 10 companies were picked, it appears to us, largely at random on the basis of a list which had geographical and geographical distribution within Australia, as well as size. Some of them didn't export, so 3 companies didn't export, and one was in fact a distributor. Countervailing duties was flagged at the same time as they launched the anti-dumping. Now, countervailings was launched on the 31st of August. It's all about subsidies. And the Chinese have been claiming that they've been suffering because there's been a large number of Australian wine exports at lower prices. They've caused damage to the domestic industry, and the subsidy programs have contributed. So 40 programs were named. Probably the specific wine-related ones were the wet rebate. And obviously this will put the wet rebate under threat into the future. There were the various components of the wine export and regional support package, the 50 million package, as well as many general agricultural programs. There is no evidence to us that any of these programs are either significant, applicable for countervailing duties, or have the potential to have caused damage to Chinese industry at all. So the time frame is similar to anti-dumping, so it's due to be finalised by the 31st of August. I guess there has been a further development on the anti-dumping, which happened on, which I haven't got a slide on because it happened on Wednesday afternoon. And that was the fact that there's been a sampling questionnaire that's been now put out. So the 31 registrants for the anti-dumping case is clearly a large number and probably too difficult for the Chinese government to analyse within that time. So they have decided to get some further information, decide what sample of the 31, or indeed of anyone else, that they would like to look at to assess whether dumping has occurred. It's quite a substantial questionnaire. It looks at both company structures so that the Chinese government can it's going to analyse whether there's any impact on those structures. It also looks at the quantities on the products that are exported and tries to categorise those. And there's a fair bit of work to be done in this. 10 days to fill in the questionnaire, has to be in Chinese, a lot of information. It's going to be a hell of a big job to do. And so how are we going to succeed in this? Well, it does require an enormous effort. We've got limited resources in Australian grape and wine. What we've done is we're ensuring that all the companies named register and complete questionnaires. So we've done that. They've registered. The questionnaire process comes later. These questionnaires must meet Chinese government requirements. If they don't meet the requirements, the exporter can be deemed as uncooperative, and that means you can be hit with a punitive tariff of up to that 200% that has been discussed. Even if the information is provided and we have a strong case, which we believe we do, we still need to have successful negotiations to ensure that both industry and government can work away happy. We know industry is suffering and we know they had a receptive government, so we need to get a solution that solves the Chinese problem as well and helps the industry. We do know that if a punitive tariff is imposed, it's going to have a dramatic effect on exports, and that flow-on effect in other markets and domestically will be very strong, and it will impact on grape prices. It will impact right throughout the supply chain. So it's an area that we cannot afford to take lightly. We as an organisation are delving deep into our reserves. We've got legal firms in China, we've got legal firms in Australia, and you know we're trying to get more resources, but it's a big job, and that's what we're spending a lot of time on at the moment. Let's talk about some other things. So Brexit, no one's talking about Brexit anymore because we've all forgotten about it. It's fair to say that it's not going well. So the EU and the UK are in the middle of a really bitter fight over a planned law that will violate the Brexit agreement. And there's bugger all trust between these two economies at the moment, and there's going to be less following this. So what we do know is that it is getting more and more likely there'll be no trade deal between the UK and the EU. This does have a lot of impact on Australia. So we do export a lot of wine into the UK, which is then processed or packaged and then re-exported, or even just re-exported. That will not be resolved in a way that meets our requirements unless these two countries start to talk together, and there's very little we can do about it. So unless we can get an agreement in the next month between the EU and the UK, there's going to be an economic disruptive no-deal exit on the 1st of January, and none of us will like that. But while there's serious implications for Britain and the border disruptions are going to impact probably on wine from Europe in the UK even more dramatically than Australia. So the wine trade across the channel is going to be very, very disruptive. Just having a border is going to slow down movement of wine. It's going to impact on obviously our bulk wine exports to the UK, which are packaged and set to mainland Europe. And it just shows that it's a critical time for our FTA negotiations with the EU and the UK. And we're currently having negotiations with the EU this week and next week. They are going to go slow. There's no chance of a successful conclusion in any of these this year. And the UK, of course, because of the distraction with the EU and their negotiations, it will take some time longer. I think it's important to talk a little bit about the rules-based trading system, the World Trade Organization. The way through some of the morass of geopolitics and the different strategic partnerships and relationships has always been to have an international trading system you can rely on that sets rules. That means small countries have a defense. The WTO is under threat, and it's under threat in that the fact that the US have removed their resources and prevented an appeals process within the WTO. But it doesn't mean it's the end of the WTO as an effective organisation, because all the other remaining rules remain in force. So all the rest of the world, even China, are looking to work with the WTO, understanding that we need it to control outcomes. So it just means that it's not working perfectly at all. So it's going to be a defining year ahead, I think, for the WTO. And the next Ministerial Council, which has been postponed a year due to COVID, is going to be key to resolving what's happening. It's absolutely vital to Australia, and it's absolutely vital for the wine sector to have a WTO that works. The agreements, and particularly the way of settling disputes, have been proven time and time again that have been effective for us. And these agreements, of course, are not static, and they're renegotiated from time to time. So it does work. So we've recently had a WTO case with Canada when we've reached a partial settlement following the dispute around some of the both federal and provincial wine measures. And so what it will do is create a platform where we have more even playing field within Canada. It's pretty important to note that it wasn't just about Canada while we were looking at this case. It was more that the US was seeking to negotiate preferential treatment. And if the US got the same treatment as Canadian wine industry, that could have had devastating effects on our impacts to Canada, which is our fourth biggest market. And it's a good, profitable market for those who are in it. So we have been trying to, and during this process, to work more closely with the Canadian industry. And in these partial settlements, I work very closely with the Canadian vintners and Dan Paswalski there to try and get to some result. We didn't want to hurt the Canadian industry, but we couldn't afford to have these measures to continue. So it's a system that works. We couldn't have done this without WTO action. We tried for 3 years to get our government to resolve this bilaterally. Canada didn't want to talk. It took the WTO action to do it. So it's a system that we know can work. The WTO action, as I say, can't resolve trade dispute appeals. Hasn't, because the US has blocked the appointment of judges, but the rest of the world, including Australia, China and the EU, have now adopted an interim system. We're almost the first to trial that with our wine case, but because we resolved most of it externally, we won't be. I'll talk a bit about COVID. It's clearly had and will have dramatic impacts on the sector. The closure of on-premise venues has had a dramatic impact, particularly in those countries like Europe, where there's 60% of sales are actually on-premise. That's been reduced dramatically. We're officially in our first recession for almost 3 decades. We went backwards by 7%, I think, in the June quarter, but we'll go back more in the next quarter. It's clear that most businesses have decreased or are not expanding, and more than a third of those businesses, according to the Reserve Bank, expect to struggle financially over the next 3 months. And as JobKeeper and JobSeeker are wound back, we will see businesses that do not survive. Internationally, it's clear that keeping trade flowing requires that cooperation and trust. The geopolitical nature of the world means there's very little of that floating around. And it's a particular challenge because of that. So particularly with the international trading system subject to the restrictions and distortions, we've seen tariff increases among the major traders. We've seen subsidies being put in, and it's very difficult now to get that dialogue to manage and prevent the tensions because we've got mobility restrictions. So normally with the China case, I'd be on a plane to China. That just cannot happen now. And so we're not in a position that we can sit down and talk through some of these. And it becomes critical in resolving some of these economic issues. So that we've seen increased protectionism. The subsidies in Europe are massive. They're in the billions of dollars specifically for wine. They are about not just controlling the harvest, but on storage and promoting exports. So the world's going to be awash with wine next year. The vintage looks strongish in Europe, but certainly there's slow on-premise consumption, and that's going to remain for quite a while. So there's going to be a lot of pressure on international demand with a reduction in demand. So there's been very strong demand for wine through other channels, so off-premise and through the virtual marketplace, but it can't take all that's being produced. Inevitably, that's going to lead to pressure on grape prices, and if we can't resolve China, that's going to probably have a dramatic impact worldwide on pricing. And it's pretty clear that retailers are trying to control the e-commerce route to market. We've seen Dan Murphy's, which was struggling for a couple of years, has come back and is going in, very well at the moment. So I guess finally, just a few slides on what can we do. So look, every business needs a strategic plan, and that includes ourselves. Everyone knows that you need diversified routes to market and supply chains. So it's just the supply chains are just important. You need to be able to mitigate your risk. Very, very concerned about labour supply, particularly with skilled labour, but also pickers and also people to service machinery. The other issue about labour is modern slavery, which is loosely defined as paying people what you're meant to pay them. And we know that we dodged a bullet last year because COVID meant that we couldn't be investigated properly. So people need to be aware that their labour hire companies are going to be absolutely, you need to make sure they are rigid-ditch. I talked a bit earlier about risk of losing social license. We've already had a battle with pregnancy warning labels. Everyone's business to try and make sure that we are there. I guess the internet, the plug for us, we're needed for this because there's no one else who can do this alone. So we can navigate the big national, international issues. Individual companies cannot do it. So I guess, are we all right? Well, we don't know what's going to happen in 2020. We know the worst is yet to come for many small businesses, and we know there's a lot of businesses that are on the market. The recession will continue. Employment will take a long time to return to pre-COVID-19 levels, and that means business and investment confidence will take time. Again, it's the domestic market will take priority for many companies, and we need that for our recovery. And China was always going to be our way out of COVID, but the geopolitical tensions have now put that in danger. So it makes it a very, very difficult situation. And it knows the world will be very different post-COVID-19. I've talked to a lot of commentators, so it won't. I just don't agree with that. I think there's so much movement. So finally, the last slide. I think it's clear that the rise of protectionism will continue. Everyone's domestic market, everyone's wine industries around the world are under pressure, and that governments will look to support them. The anti-alcohol lobby has been emboldened by the pregnancy labelling. They had a good win on pregnancy labelling, and now they are looking at added sugars, they're looking at nutritional labelling, and the next big cab off the rank for them is going to be cancer warnings, and that's a very strong push. We know that grape prices will come under pressure in 2021. If it wasn't for COVID, it will be for China. And we know that, so businesses really need to look at how they're structured and how they're going to work. China, the big unknown, we're pulling out all stops to work on that. We're doing a lot of 17-hour days at the moment. It's been a pretty tricky one, and we've got a couple of months to go. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be difficult, but we have to be in it and give it our best shot. So we, again, an unashamed plug is that we've got a big part to play in that business environment to ensure that, we can all work better and all prosper. You can't solve the geopolitical situations, but you can do things to make sure that we are better able to respond to those external shocks. So we can do that both at the business level and we can do that at the industry level. I can't do it at the business level for you, but we can do it at the industry level. So that's just, it's a really quick run through. I could have talked a lot about the other geopolitical issues that are on the horizon. I just picked out a few of the major ones, but there are many others, and it's just a very dynamic, very difficult period. So thank you. Happy take any questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tony, for your concise update around some of those major factors affecting industry and how producers can position themselves to mitigate risk associated with those factors. As Tony's already indicated, we're going to roll from here into a Q&A. Tony's going to stick around for a little while to answer any questions you may have. So please make use of this opportunity. If you're not sure on how to ask a question, just open the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar, type your question in and click to send it through. Okay, we've had a couple of questions come in while you were speaking, Tony, so I'll jump right into them. What's your advice, or do you have concerns for the sector with regard to JobKeeper and, in more pointedly, when it reduces or finishes in the new year?
Oh, absolutely, I do. I think particularly for smaller businesses in particular, it's got the potential for a massive impact, and not just for directly to companies. I think also because of the on-premise side of it. So many of our smaller producers in particular, many of the high value product goes into the on-premise, and I think they're going to really struggle when the JobKeeper goes down and unwinds. Now, we know that the government is considering this. The budget is due in, I think it's the 3rd of October. It's very soon anyway, 6th of October, 3rd, one of those dates. And we know that they're going to be talking about what they're going to do to try and alleviate that. But I think a lot of businesses are going to be come under a lot of threat. I'm very concerned about it.
Okay. I've got a question here also about how producers can ensure labour hire companies do in fact pay the correct wages. Checking down the chain is difficult, particularly with potential language barriers.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We're doing a lot of work on this at the moment. One of the things we will do is we're trying to get out both, I guess, a checklist of what you need to do and how you need to cover yourself in such a situation. And we'll get that out by this vintage. We've created a working group to look at these issues. You cannot guarantee your labour hire company is doing everything right, but you need to ask the right questions. And one of the critical elements is making sure people know that, one, they have to ask the questions, and secondly, those questions are right. And then, you can then identify and give yourself cover. The other way that a lot of people do is actually make sure that they see every wage statement that goes to employees. Some of these are going to be far too complex for some businesses. And thirdly, I guess the other thing is that a lot of these businesses, labour hire companies, will now need to be accredited under state law to operate, which will give another defence. But it comes down that you need to have an agreement and ask the right questions and have a written answer, and we'll be helping to provide that guidance.
Sure, thanks, Tony. Some really sound advice there. Hope that helps, Claire. A question here about whether there are opportunities to use other resource commodities in the bilateral trade discussions regarding the China anti-dumping wine investigation.
So yes, and absolutely. So the first thing we did on those, one, was to gain advice from the barley and the sugar industries who had anti-dumping or countervailing duties investigations with China in the past, and they gave some really good advice, which we've taken aboard. I also had a meeting with all the agriculture industries last week, where we talked about how we could work on a collective response with both our government and externally to try and work together, because as a single industry, we're probably not big enough or ugly enough to control the outcome. But when we get all of agriculture together, we've got more opportunities. So yeah, it has to be a collective response. Every other ag industry is scared about being picked off one by one. They've watched barley, they've watched wine, dairy think they're next. So it's trying to get that collective response is really important. And also trying to make sure that we get an appropriate and, I guess, government understanding of the value of the economic partnership we have with China. It doesn't mean you have to abrogate your responsibility in foreign policy, by no means, but it does mean that we need to understand what some of the pressure points are.
Sure. Also got a question here about sustainability labelling and whether this is going to impact in a positive or negative way. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, I certainly don't think it'll impact in a negative way. So most people probably know that we have been working with both the Australian Wine Research Institute and Wine Australia and others on the sustainability labelling. We've created I guess, a trust mark. So we've got a trademark which people can put on sustainability labelling. I think for those who want to use it as a marketing tool, and Wine Australia are committed to getting behind some of the marketing aspects of sustainability in Australia, I think it could be very useful. The negative, the risk about sustainability labelling is if you don't have enough people who take it up, or if you have people who don't worry about the labelling but make claims that cannot be verified and that you are found out on things like social media. Social media is very unforgiving and very quick. So people need to live and breathe sustainability if they want to go down there. So I think it's a good thing, but it means it has to be done properly, it has to be done sincerely, it has to become part of your brand.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tony. What are your thoughts on the likelihood of the China tariffs coming into effect before this year, before the MOFCOM investigation concludes?
Yeah, thanks for that one. So the earliest that tariffs can come in, as most of you would know, is 60 days from the initiation of the investigation, which was the 18th of August. I don't think it's likely they will come in 60 days. We do know that there has been pressure put on China to introduce interim tariffs. Legally, they are obliged to consider the responses they get from the questionnaires before they put those on. It doesn't mean they have to, but they're meant to. Do I think there'll be an interim tariff? The answer is probably yes, but probably not in that 60-day period. The big question is what sort of level it will be. Some of that will depend on what the relationship we have with China is at the broader level. The other thing will depend on how well we answer our questionnaires and the facts that we give the Chinese. And the more detail we give them, the more likely it is that if they bring something in, it will be a sop for their industry to show the industry they've done something for them, but won't be enough to close our industry down. Or if the political risk is so high, they could whack us with anything. It's unknown. I don't know. All we're doing is doing what we can to mitigate that risk, and that's taking this as a technical investigation and answering it on its merits.
Okay, thanks, Tony. You mentioned the wine glut in the EU. Question here about or can you speak a little bit more about what that might mean for China and then as a flow on for Australia?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting one, and it's that dynamic, that China-EU dynamic, is a really important one. So they've recently signed a couple of agreements, so there's a good relationship between the EU and China in a trading sense. EU has been very careful to stay out of some of the other political issues that have deviled ourselves and the US in particular. That extra, certainly if we get an impact on our exports into China through a tariff, then the EU will be well placed to take advantage of that. You know, we're about 37% of the China import market at the moment. We took over from France, you know, so we've increased. I think we were about 26% last year. We're 37% now. France has gone south. I think that they will be very interested in taking back that market share. And if they get any tariff advantage, and with quite a lot of wine available, they're well placed to do it. I think the other important thing about China is, though, that 60% of the China is on premise of the market. We were hitting very good marks in that on premise market. Certainly some of the south of France, there's the Italian, not so much the Italian, but the Spanish, and also from South America, that wine is targeted at the lower price points, the ones that directly compete with Chinese in supermarkets and other liquor stores. And so that will be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out as well. But I think Europe will be seeing this as an opportunity to get back into China and get product and take back market share they've lost to us.
Sure. Thanks, Tony. Got a question here about the Indonesian market, and what are your thoughts with regards to opportunities there?
Yeah, well, certainly one we didn't get any benefit from in the free trade agreement negotiations. We did try actually very hard to get there around Bali made a free trade area. So we did put some proposals in around that, which would have been helpful. Look, it's a niche market. It's a niche in hotels and the like. It's a predominantly Muslim country, as you know. There's also some technical standards which are difficult. So they've got a couple of standards around methanol and there's another one, sulfites, I think, one that makes it difficult for us to comply. So it's never going to be a big market, but I think as a niche market and in some of those certainly hotels and the business market, it could be a useful market, but it will never be a major market until unless we can do something to get tariffs down in Bali.
Sure. Question here around the fact that US elections are around the corner, and you know there is some potential that Trump won't be re-elected. How do you think that would change the landscape?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. And I had a long discussion with my local fish and chips guy on this a couple of days ago, and we both agreed that it would probably be a good relief on international tension. So Joe Biden is no China friend. I think that's really important to know, but he's probably going to be a little bit more balanced in his response than Trump. So there is a chance it will act as a pressure valve if there's a change in leadership over there. It's by no means certain, though. I mean, it's going to be a very close election, and then it'll be interesting to see how, if there is a change, how it is reacted, because certainly the Democrats will not be doing any appeasing measures with China, but what they will do, I think, is be a bit more balanced in the approach. And I also think that will help reduce some of the tensions they have with some of the US allies, such as the EU and some of the other people that they normally have better relationships with. So it's going to ease that international global tension. So it would be I think, probably a positive outcome.
Sure. Question about whether you've got any updates on future exports to regions that might have banned or plan to ban certain herbicides. Do we anticipate that this may be an issue?
It's a big issue, having particularly Europe. So Europe is the big, and obviously glyphosate everywhere internationally, but you know it's normally headed by Europe. Certainly glyphosate will be off the top. You know, it'll be banned soon. There's no doubt about that. You won't be able to use it. It's something that we are seeing that internationally there's a big push to reduce those plant protection products, which is going to have, I think, have a big impact on cost and ability of growers to produce to spec. It worries me. We're doing everything we can to, one, get an early warning system on when these are coming from, and then trying to get the technical arguments into what we can do. Trouble with Australia is we're a small country. We don't nearly have the range of products that we can use that are available to some of the other countries, but this trend towards reducing imports is going to make it very difficult. So it's to me one of the biggest issues out there, in that we just don't have the suite of plant protection products that we need over the next few years. So it's a hard one to fix.
Yep, sure. We've probably come just about to the end, Tony. Do you have any final comments or insights that you'd just like to leave the audience with before we start to wrap up?
Look, only that, it's a really complex issue. Those questions were really insightful, but it just shows the breadth and diversity of issues that can be raised when you start to talk about this geopolitical international scene. And I guess what's critical for me is the fact that all these have an impact, not just on export products, but on everything in Australia. So it becomes a really complex situation, and that's where we need people to tell us when there's an issue, so that we can be in the best place to then respond and work out how to respond. We don't have a mortgage on good ideas either. So thank you.
Great. Thanks for your final thoughts there, Tony, and thank you for. We have got one final question come through. Yeah, we'll go with it. Do you see China making exemptions for wineries with links to Chinese investment?
It's a good question, isn't it? And so certainly it's possible that one of our strengths in this will be that there is quite a lot of Chinese investment in Australia, and that there are certainly wineries. If you look at the top 10 wineries, there's probably half a dozen of those have links in China. They're probably not your normal names. There's 2,282 exporters to China, or were in 2019, I should say, and a lot of those have close cultural links. So there is the possibility. I think it's unlikely, but it could happen, because the one thing we do know is that China want to obey the rules. We seem to be obeying the rules, and to blatantly favour one particular group would not be treated well when you by the international community. But what it could do is alleviate the impact of any retaliatory measures.
Yep, great. Thanks, Tony, for providing a response to that final question that came through, and thank you for coming in and providing some really important insights for everyone that logged in today. I'm sure everyone got a lot out of today's session. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for joining in and taking part in today's session. For attendees, as always, you'll receive a link to view the recording of this session, which will be posted on the AWRI's YouTube channel. I'd also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding and support for webinars via the AWRI Extension Project. The next AWRI webinar has just been released for registration this morning. Sonia Needs from the University of Melbourne will be providing a frost management update on Tuesday, the 29th of September. And in that same week, we'll also have Dr. Karen Bindon from the AWRI taking a look at water additions to must. Okay, thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you at the next AWRI webinar.